Okay, let's unpack this. If you picture a map of Europe in the mid-17th century, it's well, think of it like a game of Risk. This is the board,
Right, exactly.
and you look at the heavy hitters, France, Prussia, Russia, and the trend is exactly the same everywhere. And big blocks of color, these massive armies, and it's all completely centered on this idea of absolutism.
Yeah, it's the era of the Sun King, right? Louis XIV. The philosophy there is really simple. The king is the state and the state is the king. Total centralized power in the hands of one guy wearing a very, very expensive wig.
Right. One guy calling all the shots. But then if you squint at the map, you see this one tiny, kind of soggy corner. It's basically a swamp.
A very strategic swamp.
Exactly. But a swamp, it's flat, it's constantly trying to flood, and honestly, it barely looks like it should even be a country. But this little swamp is doing the exact opposite of everyone else.
It is the ultimate historical anomaly.
And somehow, this anomaly fights off the biggest empire in the world and ends up richer, smarter, and just way more modern than anyone else around them.
It really is one of the most fascinating underdog stories in European history. We are talking, of course, about the Dutch Golden Age.
The Dutch Golden Age. Now, I know when you hear the Dutch Republic, it sounds a bit like a really dry textbook chapter you skimmed in high school just to get to the French Revolution.
Fair point, yeah.
But honestly, when you dig into the sources, and we're looking at a great stack of analysis on AP European History Topic 3.5 today, the reality is wild. We're talking about the invention of the stock market, massive naval battles, and a standard of living so high that while the rest of Europe was literally having food riots, these guys were worried about, market bubbles on tulips.
It is a remarkable period. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the Dutch Republic as an era of commercial and cultural hegemony.
Hegemony, that's a heavy word to drop right at the start.
I know. It just means dominance, right? Total influence. And we really want to figure out how a decentralized group of merchants, not kings, not generals, but basically business people, managed to reject the monarchy model entirely, invent modern capitalism, and then use all that cash to fund a total revolution in art and science.
So let's start with the origin story, because this didn't just happen peacefully. They didn't just file some paperwork and magically become a republic.
Oh, definitely not. This story begins with a brutal fight for survival. We're looking at the 80 Years' War, which kicks off in 1568. Before this, the Netherlands wasn't an independent country at all. It was just a collection of provinces owned by the Spanish Habsburgs.
And the Habsburgs were the superpower of the day.
Unquestionably, they controlled Spain, parts of Italy, the Americas, the Low Countries. But the Dutch subjects were getting increasingly frustrated. You had this perfect storm of grievances building up. First, you have religion. The Habsburgs were staunchly Catholic, while the Dutch were rapidly turning towards Protestantism, specifically Calvinism.
And in the 16th century, having a different religion than your king wasn't just, a minor difference of opinion. It was flat out treason.
Exactly. It was incredibly dangerous. Then you add the second factor, which is taxes. The Spanish king, Philip II, was using Dutch wealth to fund his wars everywhere else.
And nobody likes being the piggy bank for a distant monarch.
Right. And the third factor is a deep, deep hatred of centralized control. The Dutch had a really long tradition of local autonomy. They did not want some manager in Madrid telling them how to run their own towns. So they revolted.
And this goes on for 80 years. I mean, that is a lifetime of war.
It merges into the wider 30 Years' War later on, but yes, it drags on until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That's the big moment. That treaty formally recognizes the independence of the Republic of the United Provinces of the Netherlands.
Okay, so they finally win their freedom. They kick out the king. Now, usually in history, when you get rid of a king, you find a new one, maybe a local guy.
Yeah.
But the Dutch do something really contrarian here.
This is where it gets so interesting politically. They look around at Europe, where literally everyone else is doubling down on absolutism, and they just say, no thanks, they become a republic.
Which at the time must have seemed completely insane to their neighbors. Like, who's in charge if you don't have a crown?
Precisely. And the answer to who is in charge was, well, it was complicated. It was a highly decentralized system. If you want to understand it, think of it less like a unified nation state and more like a loose confederation. You had 7 individual provinces.
And each province had its own assembly, right?
Right. They were called the provincial estates. And these estates held the real power. They handled all the domestic policy, religion, local laws, basically everything that affected daily life.
So it's kind of like if the U.S. states had 90% of the power and the federal government only had 10%.
That's a really fair analogy. They did have a federal body, which was called the States General. Its job was to handle foreign policy and war. But, and this is a huge but, it was intentionally weak. The provinces had veto power. So if one single province said no, the whole thing just stalled.
That sounds incredibly inefficient.
Oh, it was. It was agonizingly slow. But that was a feature, not a bug. It protected local rights. It ensured that no central authority could just steamroll the little guy.
But let's be totally clear about who the little guy actually is here. Because this wasn't a democracy where the peasants were casting votes, right?
Oh, definitely not. This was an oligarchy. Power was held very tightly by two main groups. You had the wealthy rural landowners and, much more importantly, the burghers.
The burghers, the urban gentry, the wealthy businessmen, the merchants.
Exactly. So the people making the laws were the ones doing the business. The policies were explicitly designed to help commerce thrive.
So the government was basically run by the Chamber of Commerce.
In a way, yes.
Now, I have to ask about a glaring issue here. You've got a committee running the country, and that's fine for debating tax rates or trade routes. But what happens when the Spanish army comes marching back over the border? You can't run a military campaign by committee.
And that is the fatal flaw of republics historically. You need a decisive leader in a crisis. The Dutch solution to this was a really unique office called the Stadtholder.
The Stadtholder.
Yes, each province appointed a Stadtholder. Often, it ended up being the same person for all the provinces, usually someone from the House of Orange. But this person wasn't a king. They didn't have absolute power to just pass laws.
But they were the military leader.
Right. They were the ceremonial leader and, crucially, the top military commander.
So it's basically a safety valve. You get your liberty and your slow, careful debates for peacetime, but you have a Stadtholder to lead the army the second things get dangerous.
Exactly. It balanced the fear of a monarchy hangover, that fear of a tyrant taking over, with the very practical need for national defense.
Okay, so they've got this weird, headless, decentralized government run by merchants. But it works. And it doesn't just work. It makes them rich.
Incredibly rich. We really have to talk about the economic engine now.
Right. This is part 2 of our dive, how to get filthy rich in a swamp.
Step 1 is geography. They are sitting right on the Atlantic Ocean at the mouth of major European rivers like the Rhine, so they are perfectly positioned to be the middlemen of Europe.
But geography isn't enough on its own. You need the tools to exploit it.
And that's where the innovation comes in. The Dutch developed highly advanced shipbuilding technology. Specifically, they built a ship called the Fluet.
The Fluet. I've actually seen pictures of these in the source material, and they are not exactly the sleek Ferraris of the sea. They're round, they're wide, and they have these flat bottoms.
They're not pretty, no, but they were brilliant. Unlike English or French ships, which were built to double as warships, so they had reinforced hulls and heavy cannons taking up space, the Fluet was pure cargo. It maximized hold space and used a special block and tackle rigging system that allowed it to be sailed by a much smaller crew.
So you're paying fewer sailors to run the ship, and you're carrying way more stuff.
Exactly. Their shipping costs were a fraction of their rivals. They could undercut literally everyone. They became known as the carriers of Europe. I mean, even if you were French and you absolutely hated the Dutch, you probably hired a Dutch ship to move your wine because it was just so much cheaper.
They were the FedEx of the 17th century.
They really were. And all that global trade flows right back to Amsterdam, which becomes the financial hub of the world. Think of 17th century Amsterdam kind of like modern New York or London. It provided the banking, the insurance, the physical infrastructure to make global trade happen.
And speaking of global trade, we have to talk about the heavy hitter here, the VOC.
The Dutch East India Company.
Now, in a normal history class, you hear about companies all the time. But the VOC wasn't just a business. It was something else entirely.
It was a beast. It was the first true transnational corporation. But the real innovation, the thing that changed the world, was its structure. It was a joint stock company.
Break that down for us. Why does joint stock matter so much?
Well, before this, if you wanted to send a ship to Asia for spices, you took a massive personal risk. You and maybe 2 rich partners put up all the money. If that ship sank in a storm or got taken by pirates, you lost everything. It was a high-stakes gamble.
So only the super rich could even afford to play the game.
Right. Joint stock changed all of that. It allowed thousands of people to pool their resources. You weren't buying an entire ship, you were buying a tiny share of the company. It spread the risk across a huge pool of investors.
So it democratized investing. Well, for the people who had some spare cash lying around anyway.
It institutionalized commerce. It meant the company had permanent capital. They didn't have to dissolve the partnership after every single voyage. They could build entire fleets, build forts, and maintain a standing army to strictly enforce their monopoly in Asia.
And if I wanted my money back, I didn't have to wait 2 years for the ship to return from Java.
No, you could just sell your share to someone else who wanted in. And that right there is the birth of the stock market. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was literally created just to trade these shares.
So they lock down the spice trade. They have the best cargo ships. They have the dominant banking system. What does this actually look like for the average person living in the Netherlands?
That's maybe the most telling part of the sources we looked at. They highlight that while other European populations were facing frequent food riots and subsistence crises, the Dutch had a remarkably stable, abundant food supply. They had the highest standard of living in Europe.
That is wild to think about. If you lived in France, you might be starving because the local wheat harvest failed. But in the Netherlands, you're eating fine because your country just imported grain from the Baltic using those high-tech fluid ships.
Exactly. Wealth bought security. Even the poor in the Dutch Republic generally ate better than the peasantry in France or the German states.
So you have all this money flowing in. You have no king telling you how to spend it. You have a society entirely run by merchants. What do you actually do with your time and your cash?
You invest in culture and science. But even here, the Dutch did it completely differently than their neighbors.
Let's look at religion first. Because at this exact same time, the rest of Europe is basically tearing itself apart, killing each other over which version of the Bible to read.
Right. But the Dutch Republic adopted a policy of religious toleration. Now, they were officially Calvinist, but they offered a degree of freedom to Lutherans, Catholics, and crucially to Jews that was just unheard of anywhere else.
Was this out of the goodness of their hearts? Like a genuine belief in human rights?
I think we can credit them with some early Enlightenment ideals, sure, but mostly. It was strategic. It was just smart business. By being tolerant, they attracted top talent, capital, and refugees from all over Europe.
Makes sense. If you're a brilliant Jewish merchant or a highly skilled Protestant craftsman being actively persecuted in Spain or France, you pack up and you move to Amsterdam.
Exactly. It was a massive brain drain for the rest of Europe and a huge brain gain for the Dutch. This influx of skill and money fueled the economy even further.
And that explosion of wealth creates the Dutch golden age of art. Thinking of the big names here, Rembrandt, Vermeer.
The absolute heavyweights. But notice the shift in the subject matter. In Italy or France at this time, who is paying for the art? The Catholic Church or the king? So you get massive paintings of saints, martyrs, or the king looking heroic on a horse.
But in the Netherlands, there's no king. And the Protestant church doesn't actually like fancy decorations in their places of worship.
So the patrons become the burghers. The merchants. They want art for their townhouses. And they don't want giant paintings of Greek gods. They want paintings of themselves.
Like, paint me counting my money in my nice clothes.
Sometimes literally that. Or they wanted landscapes of the land they had just reclaimed from the sea. Or domestic scenes. Think of a woman pouring milk or a girl with a pearl earring. It was highly secular art. It celebrated regular middle-class life.
It's the birth of the consumer art market. You didn't have to be a duke or a pope to own a painting anymore.
It really is. And that intellectual openness, that pragmatism extended right into science, too. The source material spends time on figures like Christian Huygens.
The astronomy guy.
Astronomy and physics, yes. He invented the pendulum clock, which completely revolutionized timekeeping. He discovered the rings of Saturn. And he could do all of that because the environment supported free inquiry.
And then there's the microscope guy, Leeuwenhoek.
Antony van Leeuwenhoek, he's such a great example because he was a draper, a cloth merchant. He wasn't some elite university professor, but he used better lenses, originally just to inspect cloth to discover bacteria. He revealed the entire microscopic world.
It really seems like there was a cultural obsession with just looking closely at things, whether it was a business balance sheet, a painting of a flower, or a drop of water.
That's a fantastic way to put it. It was a society obsessed with observation, detail, and reality, rather than the religious mysticism or royal propaganda you saw everywhere else.
So let's try to pull all these threads together for you. We've got a swampy corner of Europe that decides to just ignore the rules of the game.
They wholly rejected the absolutist trend.
Right. They set up a decentralized government run by business owners. They used that freedom to build better ships and create financial tools like the VOC.
Which brought in massive, unprecedented wealth.
And they used that wealth to create a tolerant society that produced some of the greatest art and science in human history.
That is the formula. You reject centralized power, empower the commercial class, build a stable society, and excellence naturally follows.
Sounds perfect.
It was certainly effective for them. But if we zoom out to look at their legacy, it's even bigger than just the art or the ships. The Dutch basically created the blueprint for the modern world. Global finance, the stock market, the very idea that a state can be powerful and prosperous without being an autocracy, it all starts right here.
It's the proof of concept for the modern Western liberal democracy.
Loosely.
Mostly.
Yeah.
And that mostly is where the nuance really lies.
Right, because we can't ignore the oligarchy part of this story.
No, we absolutely can't. And this actually brings us to a provocative thought to leave you with. The Dutch model relied heavily on wealthy businessmen effectively running the government. The policies were great for commerce because they were written by commerce.
Which worked incredibly well for producing a golden age. It did. But it forces us to ask a really difficult question that still resonates today. Is a government run by business, for business, the ultimate engine for human prosperity, as we saw in the Netherlands? Or does it eventually create a system where the definition of a citizen starts to look a whole lot like a shareholder?
Can you have a government that prioritizes profit and still protects the people who don't have any capital to begin with?
That is the structural question the Dutch Republic leaves us to grapple with.
Definitely something for you to think about the next time you see a Vermeer painting or, check your stock portfolio.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Dutch Golden Age.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.